Hi, my name is Stace Johnson. I'm here to host the Ed Bryant panel for the MileHiCon 52 virtual. We had a little bit of a scheduling mishap, and I'm trying to get a hold of my cohort that's going to be joining me, Jean-Philippe Gervais. He's going to have some things to say about Ed's upcoming three-volume complete works. Hi, Rose. I saw your note there. Um, so if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I'm going to try to get him on the phone or on social
And
media to get him
and
to
while
join
you
in real
do
quick.
that, I'll introduce myself a little bit since I'll
Perfect.
participate a little bit. Um, my name is Matthew Squire. I'm a part of the con committee here at MileHiCon, and I'm the Zoom host for this memorial panel. Um, we would like to make sure everybody's involved um, and just bear with us for a moment. My apologies. We're just going to take it slow and see um, if we can't get everybody on board. Um, yes. So anyway, I haven't had much time to prepare for the panel. I thought maybe I could. Yes, I think we could do that, Rose. Let's do this. If you could post a question in the Q&A, and then I can have you answer that live as a tribute to Ed Bryant. It doesn't have to be anything questioning. It's just something to make you appear in the panel. It's right there on the on your Zoom panel there. And maybe I can just promote you. Here we go. I'm gonna just promote you, Rose. Just a second. There you go, Rose. This is Rose Beatham.
Am I there?
Yes, you're here. Thank you.
Oh, okay, because I don't see myself, so I will.
Yeah, you could. You
That's
have to enable the video if you'd like to. If you'd like
uh,
to grace us, but you could go. You could just do audio if you want.
I don't see where to do that. Do I have to log off and log back in?
It is in the next to the mute button.
But it isn't.
It isn't. Okay. Well, I guess we have
I've
audio
got
on.
select a microphone, select a speaker, test speaker and microphone, fits audio settings. It's all. I think it's because I came in as a participant.
Right.
I don't.
Well, let
I
me
don't.
let me see if I said allow to talk. Maybe there's more that I can do here. Oh, you're not even a panelist yet. Let me
No,
really
that's the thing. If
promote
you
you.
want to temporarily make me a panel,
Yeah, I know. Let's do that. So you should be panelist material now. Here we go.
oh, there I am.
There we are. All right. So now maybe you can show your video. The button might.
There we are.
Ah, there we go.
I will take off the weird thing because then I won't be fading in and out. But yeah, so while Stace is getting Jean-Claude, I'm very excited about the compendium, Stace. So we have a timeline for when it's supposed to actually emerge into the world like a giant butterfly.
Well, there were a number of timelines, and a couple of them got pushed back, and COVID did not help with that, unfortunately. But Jean-Philippe will talk more about that. I got him on the phone. He's going to be joining in just a minute here.
Okay.
But the good news is that the lion's share of the layout and so forth is all done on it. Um, the the only thing that really, excuse me, the lion's share of the proofreading and the I guess the basics, but not necessarily all the layout, are done. So all the proofreading, all the text is in. They just need to finish up a few more layout things, and then they'll be able to go to press. My understanding is they're looking for Christmas, and what they're going to do is release the first two volumes first, which is all going to be fiction, and then after that, they will work on starting to put together the third volume, which will be the nonfiction work. So, but excuse me, Jean-Philippe will say more about that when he does get joined in. Um, and I know he's working on it. Apologies. He and I both thought that this was at 3 o'clock. I'm sorry. What other questions do we have in here?
Patrick Swenson says something about, said he hadn't heard anything for a while.
People
And then I think he heard your comments, and then Frank Rorschach says, "Yay!"
Yeah, those are our
we all
questions.
say yay.
Yeah, Patrick. We all, I think, are on George's contact list, and my understanding is that that list is still intact. Part of the problem is that COVID slowed George down too. I don't know if that means that George got it or if that what that means, but I know that that there was a slowdown in the production of it due to the fact that George became, the publisher became ill. So it's been a little bit of a struggle on his end. It's one of the advantages of working with a small press is that you can get a very personalized thing made and put it all together. One of the disadvantages is that it doesn't take much for something to put that on a side note. Yeah,
Well,
no doubt, Patrick, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, let's just, put it out there. It's like we all loved Ed, and it's like, hey, this is coming in a lot faster than some of his projects where he promised them for decades. We love Ed, but it's like, man, we know he did that.
Yep.
And even the Baku,
Right.
which eventually came out, how late was that?
I see we have Jean
Okay.
coming in now.
Here he
All
is.
right.
And
All
he's
right,
Stace
once-
Johnson. Do you want to? I can change his name real quick.
Oh yeah, he had to
Yeah.
log in as me because Meg didn't know that he was going to be on the panel. So
Actually,
I had to give
I'll let
over.
him. I'm not sure how to spell everything in his name, so I'll let him change it.
He should be Stace Johnson too. It can be like,
Oh, that's fine.
Sure,
That's
yeah,
fine.
the clone. The clone.
That's
yeah.
fine. I can be Stace Johnson too. That's fine.
The sci-fi
Oh, good! I
system.
learned French.
Yes.
Stase now, Stase.
Let's see. Rose. Yes. Very good. Very good.
I
Yes.
popped in because you weren't here, and I figured we could reminisce about Ed. I mean, I'll have to drop off to go do my afterlife panel. How appropriate is that?
I mean, I'm sorry we were under the impression that it was at, I guess, 3 o'clock your time and not 2 o'clock your time. So,
Yep.
okay.
So anyway, we're all here now, and Rose, thank you so much for jumping in. I appreciate it.
Like I said, I'll drop off at about 2:15 because I have to go get ready for my versions of the afterlife, which, as I said,
Yep.
is such an appropriate thing to do after this. 'Cause
Yeah, for sure.
with
For
Ed
sure.
having his literary afterlife, thanks to you too, and I'm just so pleased that it's going to eventually and finally come to fruition.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can I interject real quick? I'm afraid I never knew Ed, and I would love to hear more about him.
Uh-huh.
So maybe we could just open up a little bit and.
Well, which of us goes back the furthest? I think I have.
You.
I have seniority here, so this is.
Oh, yes.
So I will tell some of my stories about Ed, and then if I have to leave, they can pick it up with the later. And Stace has more of a collegial thing. Although I will say, years and years and years ago, I was in a writers group with Ed when I was in high school. He had moved here to Denver from Wheatland, Wyoming, and came to my DASFA. He was our first guest at an early MileHiCon when we first started having guests. He was our Toastmaster. MileHiCon is a lot of what it is today because of all Ed did to help us out in early days and all through. I mean, clear up until the year he died. If I needed help on something, I would call him. He would provide advice and contact information and ideas and support and stuff for the auction. And he was just always fabulous, fabulous. And, but when I was in high school, I was in a writers group with him for a while. So was my mother. And I always remember there was a story that he wrote. It was one of his Cinnabar stories, the one about Hayes and the heterodyne.
Yeah.
Or maybe that wasn't what it was really called. But I just remember he read it in the workshop. And the next meeting, my mother had been inspired and she did a parody of it. And she read it and he just sat there and he's kind of going, I don't know if there's ever been a story that was parodied before it was ever published. But, you know, Mom was always, you know, in her little elder goddess, that was her Spanish nickname way, so proud of Ed, you know, because he became a writer. He was our writer. And, you know, she just loved him to death. And like I said, there's just so many times that Ed was so helpful, and you could always count on him to be a fabulous fabulous panelist and participant, and willing to do. I mean, I have pictures of him when the year Somtow was here, and Somtow is like a pope in the Church of World Peace. He actually became a pope at MileHiCon because he'd only been like an archbishop, and you raised up depending on how many people you ordained. And we held a mass ordination at MileHiCon. I have a picture of Ed with a lampshade upside down on his head doing the ordination. And partway through the ordination, the power went out in the hotel. We're all kind of going, we're being struck dead because of, you know, horribleness. But, and I have a button somewhere. Back when we used to do the dances with authors, we would do a dance and we'd have like a dance card. And authors could say, I would be willing to dance to X. And Connie Willis was never willing to dance. She says she draws the line at dancing, but she was willing to sit out with people. And so people would buy a sitting out with Connie. And I knew some of the songs because I was doing programming. And so I knew some of the songs that were suggested. And I knew one of the songs Ed had suggested, and he liked David Bowie, Modern Love. And so I immediately arranged to buy that one, and I had a button machine. And so I had made a button, and when I went up to grab him and drag him on the dance floor, I was wearing my button that said, I bought Ed Bryant for Modern Love. So,
that is excellent.
like I said, I mean, Ed was just, he was one of a kind from the early days to his, you know, his final moments running around as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle in his little suit thing. You know, it's like, Ed.
I wonder if I can find a quick picture of that and put it up on the screen.
That would be wonderful. Yes.
Well, actually, let me go in a little bit here and talk about, for those people who may not know, the man who joined us, who's on my screen directly below me, is Jean-Philippe Gervais. I understand he may not be on that same location on your screen. He is the man who's putting together the complete works of Ed Bryant, and he joins us from Montreal.
So hello, Stace, and hello everyone in Denver. I've been going to Denver to MileHiCon for the last few years, and I had a lot of fun seeing all of you at least once a year. So it's a little too bad that this year's pandemic has had this consequence. But so last year when I was there, I told everybody that, all right, well, next year for sure the books are going to be out, and we're going to have that. Unfortunately, COVID-19 had another consequence, which is that the publisher I'm working with here in Canada is, it's like most small press, is essentially a one-person operation. And George Vanderberg, who's the publisher, is a gentleman, you know, he's about 75, George, or so. And because of COVID-19, his health is fine. It's just that he has cut down considerably in his social interactions. And that includes also all of his regular kind of publishing activities, going out to see the printers, graphic designers, artists, so on and so forth. And so that's why like throughout the summer, he was hopeful that perhaps, you know, things would quiet down and he could pick it up the work around like September. But I was in touch with him about 2 weeks or so ago, and he said, listen, he says, we'll try and pick things up a little bit later in the fall so that we can finish the project in a few months' time. Because really, when the pandemic broke out back in, when was it, mid-March or so, at that point in time, we had essentially finished the second proofreading. It's over 2,000 pages, the entire project. So I had just finished doing the second proofreading. We had finished fitting in all of the artwork, where all the artwork is going. All of that is ready. George had done kind of a preliminary layout of the entire work, all 2,000 pages of them. And unfortunately, what was then the next steps were the steps that required third-party input. So on his part, working with his usual kind of graphic designer in terms of setting out the actual layout of the book, fitting in all of the, now we know where all of the artwork is going, but just actually fitting it in there and all that, finishing all essentially the artistry of the layout of the book. So that's really where we are. And unfortunately, the project has been kind of in a standstill mode since about, I would say, I mean, we did some work together, he and I, back in April, more or less. But since end of April, beginning of May, the project has been kind of in a standstill. To be quite honest, I hadn't really realized that meant that it's about 4 or 5 months time that nothing has happened, because the time has just gone by like in a blur. But now that I think about it, that is a long time for the project to just be at a standstill. So I'm hopeful that we will resume the remaining work, and that essentially we should, I believe, be able to send things out to the printer to get maybe a couple of dummy copies made for us to look over. I would think either right before Christmas, and what that means is that once that is done, then the actual production of the actual material copies would only be so. Once again, unfortunately, here's another mile high, and it's not finished, the book, but we're almost there. And were it not for this year's pandemic, we would have had the book in hand, and it would have been my extreme pleasure to actually be physically present in Denver this weekend, for all of us to be holding it in our hands and leafing through it together. So I did want to reassure everybody, don't worry, everybody is everybody's still alive, everybody's still working on the project. It's just been, so essentially, we were aiming for October. We've been in standstill for about 5 months. So if we add up the 5 months from about now, that brings us to more or less like March, maybe something, I would think in that general ballpark, that we'll be able to finish up. And so what I'm talking about right now is finishing up all of the fiction material. So that's 2 print volumes and 1 virtual volume. The virtual volume, and I did discuss this with Stace earlier this week, our plan has been to put that on a DVD that would just be kind of inserted in just a very thin slipcase in one of the books, because on that virtual support there's going to be all of the fiction that is not in either of the 2 print volumes, and that's still about a good 800 to 900 pages long, especially since when was it, last year or so, or the year before, they kind of get confused, but I had gotten, Ed's brothers had given me access to all sorts of materials that were in Ed's brother's warehouse in Wheatland, Wyoming, and so I got access to a lot of stuff from his teenage days. So there's a few stories from his teenage days and from his high school newspaper, where he was, of course, the editor. And we did manage to reproduce all of the issues except one that we couldn't find, of the fanzine that he put out in 1962. So that means he would have been about 17 years old. And so we also have like the graphic adaptations of a couple of his short stories that were published in an old magazine in the 80s called Epic Illustrated, and also in a local Denver comics magazine called, I don't have it in front of me, but anyway, it was The Road to Cinnabar. That was in that particular Denver comics magazine, which was a small press magazine in Denver. So we've got all of that graphic work about Ed. We've got the material in a section called The Young Ed that's there on the virtual support, and we've also got all the stories that are not appearing in the print volume. And so it's going to be either on a DVD or a USB key, because we also have, in addition to the written material on there, we're also going to have some interviews of Ed. One interview done in 2010 by his friend Mark Barzotti, which is about an hour long, which is really, really interesting, because it's really kind of a look back to his life, to his works and all that. It's really well done. And the other one is an interview that was done for a local television station in Denver back in about 1981 or so, by the reporter. She's actually a member of the Friends of Ed group on Facebook. It's Kathleen, and I had all these notes prepared for our little chat here, but since we started at what to me is an hour earlier, I didn't have time to grab everything. But we got permission from from her, Kathleen, who did the interview, as well as the college, the local college in the Denver area for which the interviews were conducted. So we got their permission to reproduce that interview on the DVD or USB key as well. And we should, because I'm assuming we will have the memory space on either support. We will also include the video of the MileHiCon homage to Ed basically panel that occurred. That was in the fall of 2017. So that's the year that Ed passed away. He passed away in February of 2017. And in the October of that same year, there was a big panel where a lot of his friends came up in front of the room, kind of told stories about him and all that. So so the question is going to be, it's either going to be on a USB key or a DVD. I'm not 100% sure right now which one it is. Perhaps on for the people who are members of the Friends of Ed group, I'll just throw a question out there just to kind of do an unofficial poll, and after that there'll be issues, of course, of like costs and production complications and all that. But so that's going to be, all of that is going to be done in the next few months, finished up, and after that, the last piece of the Ed puzzle is going to be another big thick volume with all of his nonfiction, which will be all of his essays, all of his media columns for year's best horror and fantasy, and a very generous sampling of his book reviews from all of the various magazines for which he reviewed books over the years. Because he started for a local Denver, I don't know how many of you know about Mile High Comics, which is a big, I think it still exists, at least a big comic store in Denver, okay. And in the early 80s, they published a Mile High Future, which was kind of their catalog, but also a catalog that had book reviews, movie reviews done by Leanne Harper. It was actually fascinating for me to see that in this little local catalog, you had interviews with, at the time, like Frank Herbert, Harlan Ellison, I believe Ray Bradbury. Anyway, all the big names in science fiction and fantasy, as well as in the comics world. And Ed, that's where he started doing book reviews in Mile High Futures. After that, he moved on to the Twilight Zone magazine. He also did a few lesser known science fiction magazines that one was called Empire Science Fiction that had a couple of issues in the late 1970s. And actually in the very, very early 70s, he did media reviews for a college publication in northern Wyoming called Who Calls, which really didn't have much to do with Lovecraft, but had what's called that nonetheless. And so that's where he did his first movie reviews and media reviews. So anyway, and after that, Ed moved on later on after Twilight Zone magazine to Locust magazine, where he was for about 20 years or so, the book reviewer, in addition to a few other Cemetery Dance publication and Tailbones magazine, which was a local Denver publication. So anyway, so that's going to be the last volume, but we're not touching that volume until the first two are finished and actually published and in existence. One of the people was asking about Patrick Swenson says Tailbones was from Seattle. Well, okay, Patrick, so it's my mistake. I was under the impression it was from Denver. So you see, I've been involved in the Ed project for about a decade now, so that everything seems to come from Denver. Everything related to Ed seems to me to come from Denver now. So that's why. Yes, and I was saying, somebody, I don't remember, I think it was Eric, I don't remember his last name, who put up a little message here while we were talking, asking if anybody knew about any Harlan Ellison and Ed's either stories or anecdotes, I guess. In the first volume, there's going to be, the very last section is going to be called Dangerous Visionaries, basically. And it's going to be there's not really any collaborations between Ed and Harlan, but Ed wrote a number of essays over the years about his friendship with Harlan. He also wrote a short novel, about 150 pages, adapted from a Harlan Ellison screenplay back in 1973 called Phoenix Without Ashes. And he wrote one very fun essay in that called What If It Has My Face and Your Brains, or something like that. And essentially, talking about what it is like to kind of collaborate with Harlan Ellison, and it's a very fun read. But there's also a number of other essays published in like either books dedicated to Harlan or convention programs over the last 40 years, essentially, of their friendship. So that's going to be in that section, along with one story that he wrote back in the late 60s when he was staying at Harlan's house in Los Angeles, called Kicks Are for Kids, which is kind of a little homage to like very laid back Southern California from the late 60s, early 70s. And there was also a very moving story actually called The Lie That Lights that he published as one of the many afterwords to Harlan Ellison's novella, All the Lies That Are My Life, that was published in the early 80s. And that novella, for anybody who's a member of the Friends of Ed group and who saw what I posted in there about the liquidator of the estate of Harlan Ellison, who was explaining all the work he was doing. All the Lies That Are My Life was basically a long, long novella that Harlan wrote back in about 1980, dealing with a writer similar to himself who's passed away, and kind of the hold that that writer still has on his friends after he's passed away. And a number of these friends are based on real life buddies of Harlan's, including Robert Silverberg, and in particular one was Ed. I mean, the main character is apparently based on Robert Silverberg, who was a very, very good friend of Harlan's. But another one is based on Ed, and the character in there is named Brandon Winslow. So anyway, that was published as a limited edition book by Underwood Miller back in 1980. And Harlan asked a bunch of his friends like Silverberg, Norman Spinrad, Vaughn McIntyre, Philip Jose Farmer, Ed Bryant, to write afterwards, you know, inspired by this novella. And what Ed did was he wrote kind of a semi-fictional, semi-autobiographical piece about, not that long, maybe 8 or 9 pages long, about him and Harlan. But it's funny because the first time that I read it, first time I went to Ed's house back in 2013, you know, I kind of read it and it was okay, you know, but I thought it was fairly banal. But I reread it after Ed passed away. And it really suddenly resonated much, much, much stronger with me. And so I decided that's the actual last story of the first volume, because I think it closes it out on a very, very appropriate note. You know, not somber, not sad, but just kind of, you know, acknowledging kind of the mystery of life, but also the how quickly it can go by and all that, and the friendships that you make and all that. So anyway, it's a completely unknown short story that only people who bought that limited edition book back in 1980-81 would know about. But hopefully, you know, when all of you read it, you will discover something very interesting, that in just a few pages, Ed was able to really kind of evoke the feeling of his friendship with Harlan, living with Harlan, and also kind of the life of a writer and kind of the magic that's underlying all of that. And in there, for Eric, who's asking about anecdotes, in there he does recount an anecdote where he and Harlan Harlan was entertaining a bunch of guests at his house up in the hills over Los Angeles, and they decided to go down into the city to the restaurant during the evening. So Harlan and Ed could get into Harlan's car, and Harlan just speeds away very, very quickly before the other people manage to leave the driveway. Now, everybody knows where they're going, so they're not going to get lost. But what happens is that just as they're going down the very curvy Beverly Hills roads, Harlan just drives the car up a little up ramp just off the road, leaves the car lights on, and then tells Ed, open your door and just hang out the door. And so both of them are hanging out the door with the car just up an up ramp, and the lights are on and the car's blinking. And so Ed writes, I can only imagine the other people, you know, when they drove by, they were not very, very amused by our little stun there about faking this accident in the Beverly Hills. So anyway, I believe that Ed and Harlan had a very anecdote-filled life. Not many of those anecdotes have been repeated. And I know that Mark Barzotti, who lives out in California, he had the chance, so whenever Ed would come out to meet with him, he had the chance to actually go up and meet Harlan and his wife and Ed, and they would all go out to dinner together. And but he said that Ed and Harlan were always very discreet about their bachelor days back in Los Angeles, living in Harlan's house. from about 1969 to about 1972, more or less. During those 3 years, Ed was almost living full time in LA at Harlan's house. And I mean, that was actually Ed's most prolific writing period, because I think Harlan kind of forced him to dig out all of the stories he had kind of worked on before and to actually finish them and, you know, polish them and send them out to publication and all that. Because when you see, I mean, you'll see in the books, we put together like his bibliography, but also the bibliography by year of publication. And it's quite fascinating to see. There's like just a burst of activity in the early 70s. And after that, we're down to like many years, there's like one story, or otherwise there's like 3 or 4, but very rarely much more than that.
It's kind of
So,
funny,
yeah.
just to follow up on that. One time at one of Ed's writing groups that I was in, we were hosting the meeting at my house at that particular point, and it was a particularly difficult meeting. There was not very much that was good that was written, that was presented, and you know, of course Ed was very good at finding the gem in everything, and you know, showing people how to develop that. But after the meeting was over, I was talking with him. I was going, how do you do this? I mean, it's not like you're getting paid a lot of money. Some of these manuscripts are really difficult. How do you continue to do this every month? You know, and his response to me was that he thought for a minute, and then he said, "Well, I have some things that I want to kind of make up for in the mid '70s in LA."
That's very, very good. That's very, very good. Oh yeah. So, well, perhaps one thing that I can add is because when I informed Stace that the books were not going to be ready for MileHiCon, essentially the question was, well, okay, so for this 2020 memorial panel to Ed Bryant's name, what is going to be the theme? Well, of course, we figured, okay, we're going to give a big update on the project itself. But after that, I figured perhaps we could chat a little bit about some of the themes that are running through Ed's fiction. There's a few there that for the people who are quite familiar with Ed's fiction will no doubt resonate. And I think that, and I mean, again, this is the kind of thing that you'll be able to kind of perhaps appreciate more when you have the stories in hand to be able to read them all and compare them one with the other. But there's a few themes, and they have kind of interesting anecdotes related to them, which is the first one that really was tied to Ed's name was sharks. Now, in the early 70s, back in 1974, he wrote a very excellent short story called Shark, just simply Shark, which was his first award-nominated story for a Nebula Award. And as far as I'm concerned, despite the fact that he was still a young writer, I wonder if it's not perhaps his best story. And I know that Ed himself, either in some of the interviews he's given over the year, and even in Mark Barzon's feature on the DVD or the USB key accompanying the books, when Mark asks him, what are some of your favorite stories, Ed identifies the story Shark, and he says, you know, it's a story that I was young at that time, and I wrote it much better than I knew I was capable of writing it. And it's true that it's from a very simple theme, which is kind of a post-apocalypse, not apocalypse, but post-war world. Simply, it's a scientist who was working on for the military, an oceanographer, but who was also a scientist, and who was working on a project of actually transferring kind of human brains or consciousness into animals. And that man's lover, girlfriend, asked that her brain, I mean, Ed doesn't go into the hard science fiction details about, you know, it's a little more metaphysical in a sense than how did they actually do it. But anyway, she ends up, her consciousness, her mind, her brain ends up in the body of a great white shark, which is then trained for the military in order to participate in the war. And it's simply that after this war is over, this scientist has kind of disappeared. He's living on a small island in the Mediterranean somewhere. And the war kind of catches up with him. I just grabbed quickly the Ed's books, because the first sentence to me remains just so simple, but so evocative. So the first sentence of Shark is, "The war came and left, but returned for him 18 years later." And to me, that's typical Ed writing in the sense that there are no fancy words, there's no fancy syntax or kind of new wave science fiction gimmickry, but it's extremely evocative and kind of very poetic in a sense, but only using very simple words. And that's always something whenever he gave interviews or discussed his own writing, he always talked about wanting to kind of strip down the language he was using, so that he did not have an immediately identifiable style that somebody could say, oh, well, that turn of phrase or that particular vocabulary, of course, it's an Ed Bryant story. That he wanted to have a more kind of straightforward and, as he said, stripped down style that would really kind of let the story itself do the talking instead of kind of embellishing it with all sorts of little bells and whistles that some writers will do, mind you, with very nice effect, but nonetheless, you will then recognize their style very easily. So anyway, Ed, this was his first Shark story that was inspired actually, and he says, by a friend of his who had a dream where she was inside of a shark, but I mean, not inside instead of being eaten. She was actually living inside of a shark and of a man-eating shark. So as Ed said in an old interview from the 70s, he says, I didn't tell my friend about the psychological underpinnings for her was a man-eating shark. I just figured, what a neat idea, and so he went on from there and wrote this story. And afterwards, he wrote a few others. One in the Cinnabar stories called Sharking Down, where he dealt with the it comes back with the big prehistoric shark called the Carcharodon, Megalodon, something like that. And then, so there was that one. At the same time, his story Shark, and this I don't know to what extent anybody knows about this, but he attempted to write a novel in about 1974, of which Shark would have been the concluding chapter. And he actually wrote about 3 or 4 chapters for the beginning, but never went beyond that. But what happened is when Harlan Ellison called for submissions to the Last Dangerous Visions back in about the same time, 74, 75, what Ed did was he took those chapters and kind of worked them together to create a story called War Stories, which is constructed of those chapters that he had written for a shark novel. And so that War Stories is almost like the epitome of his shark obsession, in the sense that each and every part of it deals with sharks, either in prehistory or in the future or in the present. It's actually rather well done. And the last use of or presence of is actually the time when the landscape of the West of his childhood came back with a vengeance into his fiction, which is the early 80s. He wrote a story, which I think was before he made the move to horror. It's one of his last Nebula nominated stories, which is called. And in Strata, it takes place in southern Wyoming in the Wind River Canyon. And I mean, without giving much away, it's as if there's a presence there in the canyon that's been there since prehistorical times, when this area was still underwater, which was kind of a primeval sea where you had these humongous sharks, at the same time as the dinosaurs and all that. So it's as if you had kind of a shark-like phantom presence still kind of haunting this valley, this millions of years old valley that used to be a sea in southern Wyoming. And the imagery is absolutely beautiful, in the sense that you have this image at the conclusion of the story. You have this image of just kind of let me see if I can just find the actual sentence. Yeah, and it's so Strata. Yeah, and it's so you have these characters who have been involved, who were trying to figure out what was going on in this area, and one of the characters was actually involved with a mining company, which would open up this valley to mining, right? Which brings all sorts of issues up to rises them up. And there's been an accident. There's been a car accident or a Jeep accident, and that person who's working for the mining company is now is now dead, and his other friends, who were all kind of teenage friends together and who got back together, are looking out over this valley and sensing this presence, this kind of overwhelming presence around them. And the last two sentences are the following, that says, as the moon, and okay, so, all right, Steve Jack. So you have, look, the character of Carol says, look, as the moon illuminated the glowing sea, far below them, a fin broke the dark first surface of the forest. So it's in the sense of, again, you know, you have this kind of a fin breaks the surface of the forest. It's more of a metaphor than anything else, but it's kind of this presence. And for Ed, at that point in his life, early 80s, that concluding decade, really kind of the main, I think, metaphor that reappeared in his writing was always the shark as predator, as a creature that kind of goes through the centuries without changing, right? It's kind of an unchanging creature that just goes through the centuries. And also kind of a creature that is not, that is kind of, that it was just created by nature for a certain purpose, right? Which is just to kind of swim and feed, basically, and is not kind of a creature that is usually associated with, you know, feelings, emotions, or, for example, you know, how many dolphin stories do there exist? But shark stories, they're always kind of identified as being a very kind of cold predator and all that. And so this was kind of the conclusion of Ed's shark phase. But it also kind of brought in the era where he set many of his stories in the West, in Denver in particular, but in the West in general as well. And that's when kind of he made the move to horror fiction. And a lot of his, I mean, some of his horror stories are set in rural settings, but most of them are in very urban, they're very urban horror stories. And most of them are either explicitly set in Denver or are inspired by his own experiences living in Denver at that point in time. And so, I mean, for all of you from Denver, I mean, Ed gave a lot to the city in the sense of, you know, participating in its cultural life, but the city also gave a lot to Ed as a source of inspiration itself to Ed. I mean, all of his stories featuring Angela Black, and again, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of these, I mean, the last significant short story collections of Ed's go back to the 80s. So almost no story collections were done of his fiction when he made the move to horror. So I know some of you, like myself, are you know, read a lot of his fiction and all that. But others who are perhaps more familiar with his earlier career as a science fiction writer, a lot of these stories are going to be, I think, a very amazing discovery, because I mean, he did the transition from one style to the other with just as much success. But so Angela Black was kind of a modern witch living in Denver, who had just, you know, regular clients who would consult with her to do all sorts of things. And those stories are very explicitly set in Denver, and very often in areas that Ed knew about, little cafes or restaurants that he knew about. And actually, what's actually very fun is that he wrote back in 1990, either a long novella or a short novel about Angie Black, something about 120 pages long, more or less, called Fetish. Now she comes down from Denver and drives down to near Taos in New Mexico. But as she's driving down, she stops in Fort Garland. Now, for any of you who've ever asked Ed what was his recommended route from Denver down to Santa Fe or Taos or New Mexico in general, he would always recommend, as he did to me, to not go down straight the highway all the way down through like Las Vegas, New Mexico and all that, but rather when you go down towards the latter part of the southern part of at some point you have the city of, and perhaps Stacey can help me out, it starts with a W and it goes kind of west, the road, then it's, what is it called? Anyway, from there, you leave the main highway, right? The interstate. Walsenburg. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ron. Exactly. So you leave at Walsenburg, and then you head on down west, and you will you will head into Fort Garland, which is right almost on the border of New Mexico and Colorado, which is really kind of the more Hispanic area of Colorado. So anyway, in that story, now Fort Garland is where Ed set set his very famous horror short story called "A Sad Last Love at the Diner of the Damned," his zombie story. That's one of his most anthologized stories. He said that explicitly in Fort Garland. And in Fetish, what he does, he has his character kind of drive through Fort Garland and stop at a diner to eat, and then she meets up with a bunch of a film crew who's in town filming a movie about, he called it in there, a fatal attraction, or fatal love at the Diner of the Damned, or something like that. And so it's essentially, and I remember laughing with Ed about it, and I told him, essentially, you created yourself in a fiction setting your own movie adaptation. And he was laughing and he says, exactly. He said, I just got tired of anybody asking me to option my zombie story. I figured, okay, I'll just have my own character run into a film crew filming my story in Fort Garland, where I actually wrote it about, So that's just, an example of the fact that he, and Fort Garland reappears in one of his unpublished stories that we're going to have in the book called Surfing the Virga, which is kind of similar in theme to the Thermals of August, meaning people kind of flying through clouds and all that. But the West in general was very, very prevalent in his fiction. And I think for all of you, either native of the West or living there for so many years, it's going to be very, very interesting to read and to kind of, because I'll be curious to know if you find that he's really captured well the atmosphere of the West. For me, being from the East in Canada, I always thought that it was very, very evocative, the way that he would write about either these small towns or wide open spaces. So I see, Stace, you're raising your hand.
I can say that having read through Wyoming Sun, which feels specifically about that area, I think the land informed his writing very much. We are getting short
we
on
have
time.
10 minutes officially. I can let the panel run a little longer.
Yeah. Do you have people who have questions, maybe, or?
Well, questions or memories of Ed?
Yeah.
Anybody who has memories of Ed, you can share. We have a fancy audio system on Zoom that you can share, or you can text, and I can read them out. Anybody, just go to the Q&A on Zoom or Twitch or even Discord in the Pandora room. On Discord, and we'll take those as they come. Maybe
while those are coming in, I'll go ahead and tell a story that Rose alluded to earlier, and that was that the first time I met Ed was in 1987. I was attending Fort Lewis College in Durango, and we hosted a science fiction literature conference, and the guests happened to be Vonda McIntyre, Robert Silverberg, and Harlan Ellison. And because Harlan was there, Ed drove down, and ironically, Harlan, whom I didn't know, introduced me to Ed Bryant, whom I grew to know very well over the years. But I always thought that was ironic that the giant introduced me to the ant, so to speak. So that was just a quick story. Did anybody offer anything that they want to cover up there, Matt? Eric's asking a question. The question that I'm seeing is, did anybody go to the Harlan Ellison wake that Ed Bryant threw for Harlan? It was in the 20th century.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I was reading that, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But that's one of apparently the well-known stories about Ed is the Harlan wake. So we'd love to hear about that, especially from firsthand experience. So.
I would have loved to have gone to it, but I wasn't there.
Yeah. So
was there anybody in the room?
We did have, I believe, I'm going to call out somebody because we want to hear about it. This is for you, Eric. There we go. And Rose, unfortunately, is in another panel.
Yeah, she had to leave.
But we won't pick on you, Eric. But I think somebody said that they had made the gift for the wake to Harlan If I scroll up here for a moment, it was a laser engraved music box and plaque. So that must have been pretty sweet. Um, oh, and it was Eric Von Hall who did that. And it was, that, yeah, sounded like a pretty good present.
Mm.
Ron asked a question, and I was just responding to him to tell him that I'd cover it in the line here, or in the room here. Ron Hostler asks, won't there be a section in one of the volumes of memories that people sent in?
Yes.
And what he's referring to is that panel that Jean-Philippe mentioned from 2017. Dina Larson, who's a friend of mine and a poet locally here, had volunteered to collect memories for that people either wrote down by hand or sent in to her. And I believe that she collected all of those. And did she get those to you, Jean-Philippe?
Yes, she did. She did. And so to answer Ron, indeed, Ron, it's in volume 2. So volume 1 and volume 2, they into the fiction. There's a series of essays in both volumes. Now, in each case, and I'm looking at my table of contents, which I quickly printed out before we started here. So in each of the 2 volumes, there are 3 or 4 essays by Ed himself, kind of throughout his career. But it also comprises all of the kind of essays written about Ed after he passed away. I believe they are all, or very shortly before, like 1 or 2 of them were written specifically for the project. For example, Steve and Melanie Tem wrote a piece called Our Introduction to Ed that was written specifically for the retrospective project. Obviously was written, at the beginnings of the project when Melanie was still with us. But in volume 2, there's going to be an item. One of the essays is called Live from MileHiCon, Memories of Ed. And it does include most of the, I would say all of the kind of more substantial contributions regarding Ed that were in Dina's book. And what I mean by substantial is simply that, I mean, some people, it was just like a few lines, and I think it will mean more to the family. It meant more to the family than for example, to a reader of the volume. But for example, and without divulging the contents of Ron's own contribution, Ron contributed something that was like about 3 or 4 pages long that was very significant. And a number of people contributed similar pieces about their own relationship with Ed. And so all of those pieces are together. Like there's another one also fairly long by Frank Dorchak also. All of those are brought together in that essay, which I titled essentially "Live from MileHiCon: Memories of Ed." So that's going to be in volume 2. And just to give an idea to everybody, because that's not something I've often mentioned, but for example, you see in volume 1 we have reminiscences or pieces about Ed from Cynthia Felice, Howard Waldrop, the writer, Ted Chang, Trey Barker, Sally Shelton. And for Sally Shelton, I don't know, but also those of you who were, as I was, to Ed's memorial back in June of 2017 in Denver, Sally had read what I thought was an extremely moving piece that she had written about Ed. And I asked her afterwards if she could send it to me. It was called the Phantom Ed Syndrome. And so that's included in there. Then Ed's brother, Doug Bryant, wrote a piece called Ed in a Bar. So essentially talking about his youth and his growing up before he became a well-known writer. And we've also got a very lengthy interview by Leanne Harper that she did of Ed in the early 80s while he was still reviewing for Mile High Futures. And see, in the second volume, we have the piece by Steve and Melanie Tem. We've got a piece written by Sean Eads for an anthology published by Hex Publishers, which Sean gave me the permission to use it. We have a piece by Mark Barzotti, Don Dunn. There's a Life from MileHiCon piece. And there are 2 lengthy pieces written by Juliet Whitman, one back in the about mid-80s, and the other one in 2000. Magazine. The first one was for a newspaper in Denver, but the second one was for Westward Magazine back in 2000.
We have a comment here. It says Sally's piece was brilliant and, as you say, very moving.
Yeah.
Ron, would you like to share any thoughts on that? That would be great. You can do it through text or anything, and I can read it out. That would be great. Anyway, I guess that's it.
Well, okay. So, and the last thing is there are introductions to both volumes. One by first volume by Connie Willis, the second volume by Dan Simmons, and those were actually back in the late 90s. Ed was supposed to have two short story collections published. One is science fiction short story collection, and the other horror short fiction collection, which would have kind of brought him back into the limelight, so to speak. But unfortunately, none of those projects materialized. But at the time, both Connie and Dan had written introductions to those two projects, so they were nice enough to contribute their introductions, which they slightly updated. But they were very lengthy, very substantial introductions, both dealing with their relationship with Ed and both the stories themselves. And so they kind of updated each of the introductions, but that was again something that we kind of managed to save from disappearance through time. So this project has been a lot of archaeological work, so to speak. So I don't know if there are more comments coming in or.
So far, I think you've covered a lot, and it can be hard to really open up and talk at these things. So, but we have about 2 minutes left.
Well, Stace, why don't we? I guess anybody who's on this program and who's interested in the works of Ed Bryant, perhaps you can just finish up by talking about the Friends of Ed Facebook page, right?
Yeah, and actually, I can start posting links in Discord.
Okay.
And get and those links will appear on the YouTube video as well. So.
We can't hear you, Stace.
Yep. The Friends of Ed Bryant group is a Facebook group that was formed in, I believe, 11 years ago. I think it was 2009. I'm not positive. 11 or 12. But the point behind it was that Ed was having some health issues and was really low on money. And so what we did, Melanie, Tim, and I, and an angel investor got together, and Melanie founded a supplemental needs trust for Ed, and then I put together this website to direct people to that, and also the Facebook group where we kind of managed those donation projects and so forth. Over time, and we got him out of that scrape, and then in the future there was another one, and the group came in handy again. Since Ed's passing, it's come in very handy for doing things like organizing the memorial that Jean-Philippe mentioned earlier, and for archival information, like Dawn Dunn is working on a biography of Ed, and so when she has a question, she reaches out into that group and asks people, hey, do you have this document? Do you have this picture? Do you remember anything about this? It's a really good place to be a resource to help carry on the legacy of Ed Bryant. As a friend of mine, Wolf Moon, posted on a comment on my Facebook page the other day. He said he was commenting on a picture that he saw of me and Ed, and he said Ed had a good friend, and I said Ed had a lot of good friends. We have 450 people in this group, and we all want to see his legacy continue. So just search if you're not a member already. Search Facebook for Friends of Ed Bryant. I'm the primary admin there. I'm probably going to be the one who will let you in. I already let Eric in while we were in this meeting, actually. So anybody who's interested, that's a great resource for finding information about Ed, for looking at pictures of Ed, all kinds of things. It's good place, good people.
That's great. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Once again, I'll throw it out there. If anybody wants to say anything about Ed right now, it's better said now than not. So I've posted the links and for the Friends of Ed, and yeah, everybody misses Ed, I guess.
To reply to Eric's comment just now about the out of print works, Eric, go to Reanimus Press. It's a Denver local press that has made arrangements with the estate to produce some of Ed's out of print works there, and that's nimus.com, I think, but it's Reanimus Press. It's local. That's a good place to pick up his works that are out of print.
Mm.
All right. Well, I've posted the links, and we'll get those links on this YouTube video this recording that will of this conversation. And I wish everybody well. I'm going to say goodbye, and everybody else, would you gentlemen, like to say goodbye real quick? And
Goodbye. Thank you, everybody,
yeah.
for joining. And
All right,
also
thank you.
apologies for starting late.
Yes,
Oh, don't worry about
sorry.
it. It's okay. It happens. Especially, I mean, this convention has gone so well.
Surprisingly,
Yeah,
comparatively.
surprisingly, it was monumental that we had to put it together, and I'm so glad that we got to honor Ed here.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
This
Thank
year.
And hopefully we can all see
Yeah.
each other in Denver next year.
Yes. Here's hoping. All right.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good
Goodbye.
convention.
All right.
What's left of the
Thank you.
convention? Have a good one.
Thank you.